Hi guys, welcome back. If you were with me last time, we did a user request video. I showed you how to paint an ashigaru, and that went over pretty well, so I'm going to do another user request video this week. I don't think more than one request, but I had at least one request for how to paint a Hessian mercenary. Now, I don't think the request specified what kind of Hessian mercenary to paint, like not the regiment or what type. You know, you've got your regular guys, you've got your Fusiliers, your Grenadiers. So I kind of picked out what I want to do, and I grabbed this guy. Now you're going to say, oh gosh, Christy, that's a drummer. That's not any good at all because they always had reversed colors, and that won't help me figure out how to paint my normal Hessians at all. Well, I have some good news for you. It seems to be the case that the Hessians did not reverse facing colors on their musicians. They just wore the same colors in the same way as all the other units did, so you don't have to worry about that. The only difference was they put a lot of lace and braid and stuff on the uniform to make it fancier, like pretty much always happens with musicians and drummers. But yeah, so you can still use what I'm going to be doing here for painting any Hessian figure that you may be working on. You're just going to want to omit some of the fancy details. And that kind of goes for the Grenadier elements too, like the hat and the mustache. The uniform was still more or less the same on Grenadiers. They just had a different hat and a few little details like that. But mostly the uniform just was pretty much the same for all of the, sort of Hessians in a given regiment. I've already base coated this figure and painted his face. He ended up with a bit of a little smirk there, which was not my intention, but I think it looks good. And of course, that figure is from Perry, of course, because they have such a nice AWI range. I couldn't resist using one of their figures. And yeah, I don't know if you can tell, but I actually really like Hessians. They're one of my favorite units from this period. And they're also really versatile because, of course, I think of AWI when I think of Hessians, but of course they were also really involved in the 7 Years' War, which happened a little bit before that, and while some armies, like the British, the French, their uniform changed substantially between the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence, but the Hessian uniform basically stayed the same. There wasn't much change. So the really nice thing about these guys, if you're not into the AWI, but you are into the 7 Years' War, you can use this guide for painting your 7 Years' War figures, or almost use the figures interchangeably, in fact, because the uniform is so similar. So that makes these guys really nice because they're just more multi-purpose. You can do more with them, and you can't say that for a lot of 18th century armies. There were so many different uniforms, so many different costumes, and things were changing so much. But the Hessians were nice and consistent. So I'm really looking forward to this again. I got these Grenadiers just recently from a friend, so I couldn't resist the chance to paint some of them. I have not done Grenadiers before, you see. So I have done some Fusiliers, which I really had fun with. That's been a while ago. And if you're curious how those look, you can check out the latest black powder supplement. That's called Rebellion. It's by Steve Jones. It just came out a little bit ago. And you can see a unit of Hessian Fusiliers in there that I painted, with their commander and their flag and everything. So that's my work. Anyway, okay, that's there. I'll stop plugging myself now, and I'll just get started painting this figure. Alright, I'm going to start out on this figure by base coating all of the white areas because these 18th century uniforms tend to have lots of white bits on them, both the waistcoat, the breeches very frequently, and also most of the straps are going to be white. And in fact, I often forget bits, and you'll see me later going back and kind of adding white paint to some bits that I forgot to paint in this step, so it can get really confusing. And so what I'm doing here is just applying a mix of foundry stone light and white, so I've made sort of a lightish gray color, and that's going to be my base coat everywhere. With the base coat done, I'm going to start highlighting, and my highlight here is just going to involve mixing more white into that base color I already had, just to get an even lighter shade of gray, because when you're painting white, you want to be subtle. You don't want high contrast, or it's going to look unnatural. So the base was a kind of a light gray, the medium highlight is an even lighter gray, and then we'll finally highlight with white. But so the second shade should just be even slightly lighter, more subtle gray color, and you want it to be reasonably thin so it goes on easily and you can build up some layers, because with white the name of the game is subtle, and getting lots of variation by layering and using very slight differences in color and tone. And I'm basically putting this everywhere. The only places I'm really avoiding are going to be down in the wrinkles and creases, down between his legs. And of course you want to make sure, especially on those straps, this is pretty critical, that you make sure that you leave those dark areas defined between the different strap pieces, because otherwise that's just not going to look good. So that's one of those exceptions when you're painting white, when you've got a lot of straps and pieces of equipment like this, that you make sure that you leave those fine dividing lines. And you can even go back in later with just the plain stone white color like I did, and just pick them out again later. You may need to do that. This guy has a lot of fine strap and detail work, so, and of course there's other white on this figure that we're going to have to do later, but right now we're just going to be worrying about what's on his uniform. And just as I said, once I finished the medium layer color, I'm going back in now with just pure white, which I've thinned down a good bit, and I'm applying that over. And because it is quite thin and transparent, you'll need to apply several layers to really build up to a full pure white color. But that's what you want here, because you want to get more subtle variations in the color. The areas where I'm really focusing the white paint are going to be on the backs of his calves and on his knees, the fronts of his legs and his feet and things like that, and on his straps too, of course, sort of the fronts of the straps and such. But again, you can see I'm going to try really hard to make sure that we keep nice dark contrasting lines, in those between the sort of banding on his straps. So work really hard at that, because that's really important to this whole technique working out in the end. So yeah. This is just about taking your time and carefully building up these layers of white paint. And if you're diligent enough about this, you'll get you'll get a nice result. Having painted all the white areas, it can get a little bit tricky later on painting some other elements of the uniform, but I just like to get the white over with first, because I personally don't really love doing it, and there's a lot of areas, and a lot of them are sort of a very low level of the figure, so that's why I go ahead and do even white areas that are at a higher level, just because it's easier to do it all at once. But it does mean you have to be careful when you're painting other areas of the uniform not to mess up the white that you've just painted. I am going to start working on the uniform jacket now. Obviously there are different Hessian regiments, and you'll have to check out the colors for the one you're painting, but most of them were kind of a dark blue jacket as the base color. I'm making a base here, which is a mix of Vallejo dark Prussian blue and black, so I've got a really nice dark base color, because I found that's a good technique recently for these jackets, to really make sure your base color is very dark and then layer up from there. And so yeah, I'm just going to apply it everywhere. Now being as he's a drummer, there's a lot of braiding on his jacket. Don't worry, just ignore, pretend that's not there for right now. Just make sure you base coat everywhere that might potentially be blue, and just don't get it onto the white that we've already done. Alright, so with the base coat on, I'm going to start highlighting, and I'm going to be using just pure dark Prussian blue as my first highlight. And because we use such a dark base here, you can see there's even contrast between the dark Prussian blue and that blackish shade that we made. At this point, I'm not too worried about where this goes. You just want to make sure you don't get it into the seams or the creases at the back of the coat, because that's where you're going to see it the most. And under his arms is so dark, you don't really even have to worry about highlighting it much at all. His sleeves, of course, have a lot of that braiding on it, but what we're going to do for now is really just pretend that that's not there. Just paint them like they're normal sleeves, highlight them like they're normal sleeves, and don't worry too much about specifically highlighting areas because of the seam, and we'll get to that later. So, just go over it just like, you were just painting a large surface. I'm going to continue my highlighting by mixing some Vallejo gray blue into the dark Prussian blue here. And it's going to be kind of the same drill as before. as you can see, as I just said on the sleeves, just kind of put it all over everywhere that you want there to be like sort of a light hitting, and don't worry about the braiding and sort of molded bits there for now. You mostly want to, again, concentrate on the back and picking out the seams at the back of the coat. So sort of put this along the edges of all of the sort of the seams and wrinkles, and then blend out from there. And you can go back over it if you want and build it up even stronger, so you get a little bit of edge highlighting along those seams, because that's always really attractive. And this is quite a dark blue color, so we're not really going to highlight it beyond this point. If you want, you can add even more gray blue in and go back and do some more edge highlighting on the seams, but really this should be a very dark blue, so don't go too crazy with highlighting, especially since there's going to be so many details on this jacket. You're not really going to see the blue that much, so you don't have to worry too much about really highlighting it the maximum amount. And then I'm going to move on to the red trim on this uniform. His turnbacks are red in this particular regiment, also sort of along his lapels. Those are all going to be red. His cuffs are red, all those areas. And so I'm just going to start out now by base coating them using Vallejo Black Red. Oh yeah, and he also has a neck stock that was red, this particular unit, so get all of that. And let's see. I think I'm not missing anything. Oh yeah, of course the back of his hat. He's got that impressive hat with a metal front plate, but the back on this particular unit was also red. So you're going to want to base coat all those areas. And there's nothing you really need to know here except, again, as with the blue, a caution to be very careful while you're painting this, because you don't want to especially make a mess on those white areas. So just, you know, take your time with this base coat layer. And then I'm going to start highlighting the red areas in this standard way that I usually do. So I'm taking a Citadel Mephiston red here, which I've thinned down a little bit because it's a heavy base color. And I am now going to use that over top of all the red areas. And because that base was such a dark red, you're going to see some layering effects going on. You're going to get some sort of natural shading, which is why it's such an advantage always to work over these really dark base colors, because it doesn't take very much blending to still see a bit of that color through it. So I'm just going to be, this color is going to want to go pretty much everywhere. You just want to maybe leave some of the really dark red only sort of down in the real creases and shades. And on that hat especially, there's going to be some stripes along the back, so sort of just make sure you leave some of the dark red as an edge between those stripes and the rest of the red areas. But otherwise, you can be pretty liberal with applying this red color to him. Just, you know, just blend it kind of, you know, give it a thick blend pretty much everywhere. And now I'm going to continue highlighting using Citadel Evil Stun Scarlet. This color is really nice, bright red, and it's a little bit more transparent, so I am going to be going back over areas with that a couple of times. And it's pretty much the same as in the last step. I'm just going to be a little bit more, I'm just be a little more delicate with it. I'm not going to put it quite so many places, and I'm going to start always from the lightest area and then sort of blend it out from there. And like, for example, on the top of his hat, which is obviously going to expect to be very bright and light, you're going to want to apply most of it sort of to sort of the top part of the hat and sort of blend downward from there, because that's where you'd expect the most light to be hitting. But yeah, generally when you've got bits like this with a lot of edge showing, you should always start putting the brightest red at the edge and blending backwards from there, and that'll give you the most natural sort of, I think at least, realistic result on your figure. Now I'm really going to quickly paint this sort of apron smock that he wears. This is something that drummers have to protect their uniform and to protect the drum itself. And it was sort of leather. There's not much of this showing, so it should be really quick. I'm just going to use the Foundry Rawhide Triad for it, so just base coat it basically with your rawhide shade, and then go back in and really quickly do sort of a highlight with the rawhide medium, you know, just sort of blending it from the edges sort of inward, and then finally take that rawhide light and sort of reserve it really for the edges, and do the same thing, blend it in, but just maybe not quite so much as you did with the medium color. Now for the black areas. This figure actually doesn't have that much sort of black leather type area showing on him. You've got his shoes that you need to deal with. His sort of sword scabbard is going to be in black leather, and then he's also got a canteen. That's metal, but we also want to base coat it sort of in black. And also his hair ribbon is probably going to be black. So there's actually not too much that you really need to do here. The sword is really the major area. What I'm doing here to start out with is I'm just going to base coat everything with just pure black, and just do that very carefully. There's not really any trick to it. Just get your base coat on, and then we'll move on from there. I'm then going to highlight the black areas with first a coating of Vallejo German gray, which, it's going to go pretty much everywhere. But as I said, there's so little black or gray on this figure, you don't have to worry about it very much. So I'm just going to really kind of throw that on there real quickly, not worry about it too much. And then I'm going to make it even slightly lighter shade by mixing just a bit of neutral gray from Vallejo into that. It doesn't have to be very much at all. Because you're not seeing very much of this, and I do want it to be a pure black. I don't want it to get too light or too gray, so keep your colors, your highlights for these areas real subtle. So just a little bit, and don't even bother highlighting the canteen above German gray. That's enough. We're going to make it look a little bit metal later, so you don't have to do very much. But so just a little, just keep it real subtle with that when you're mixing the neutral gray. And I found personally in this case that was enough for most areas. I did add a final highlight on that bow. I mixed in even more neutral gray to get quite a light gray there, but that is because that is sort of silk. It would have been really shiny, so you'd expect some light, some sort of reflection, so you can add an extra highlight there. Next, I'm painting his fur mess bag or whatever it is. I'm base coating this whole area using German camouflage black brown from Vallejo. This should also be really quick. There's not much showing. It's just, again, being careful and not getting it on your original paintwork. To highlight, I'm going to take German camouflage medium brown from Vallejo, and I'm going to kind of overbrush that onto the fur because you've got that textured surface. If you're careful with your brushing, you can just do that. So I'm just applying some paint to the brush, just kind of wiping some of it off, and then very lightly going over the surface so that that light brown stays only kind of on the high areas and doesn't get into the recesses. And I'm just going to avoid sort of the really dark recess at the side and bottom of the bag, but otherwise I'm going to put that pretty much everywhere. And then I'm going to finish off with one final highlight on this area by mixing, it doesn't matter, you can use white, but I use Boneyard Light, I think, from Foundry to lighten that German camouflage medium brown up a bit. And I'm going to then apply that in the same way, over brushing it, but I'm not going to put it in quite so many areas. So it's really only kind of go on the front, sort of these areas where I expect there really to be light hitting. And, just that should go real fast for you. I'm then going to be moving on to the sort of brass areas, and I know normally I paint metallic colors towards the end of a figure, but I am doing it first in this case, and that's mostly due to this drum, because this drum would have had sort of a brass bronze base to it. The shell was covered in that, but then it has strapping and stuff over top of it, which needs to be painted white, so you need to get that lower layer of color on there first to make your life not terrible. So I'm going to be base coating using a mixture of German camouflage black brown and the Vallejo Air Gold to get a nice dark brown metallic shade. And while I'm at it, I'm going to be painting the other metal areas. So that includes some fittings, like for example on his canteen you can see the fittings on his sword and scabbard are also going to be in that color. So there's some strap sort of hardware there too, you can see. And then most importantly, of course, his hat. He's got sort of a gold brass border around the back, and then the whole front plate is going to be a brass gold color. So you can just pick out all of those areas, and most of them are pretty distinct, so you shouldn't have to worry too much in this case about getting color where you really don't want it or anything like that. And I'm now going to continue highlighting the brass gold areas with just pure Vallejo Air Gold. You can see on the drum I'm applying the color to the middle and sort of blending it out so you can kind of keep some of that dark color down in the edges and recesses. And you'll want to do that everywhere too. So the same goes for the sword and the sword fittings. Kind of leave a dark edge where there's distinct parts. And of course that's really important on the hat because he's got sort of a lion emblem on the front. You're going to want to pick out all the high areas in gold. And then sort of the lower areas, you don't want to really leave them totally dark brown. What you're going to want to do there is maybe a little overbrushing. So paint your high areas first with your brushes really loaded, and then when there's less paint on it, then you can sort of lightly go over some of those slightly more recessed areas. You only want to leave the really dark brown really down in the creases that define those areas. So, you know, that's basically it. And then after I've got that the way I want it, I want to add, of course, one final highlight to this guy because I want him to be nice and bright and really blingy. So I'm going to add some Vallejo Air Silver to my gold, kind of make a 50-50 mix, and I'm going to really, you know, I'm going to lightly highlight areas, especially like the drum. Those are big surfaces. You only want to really lightly highlight there and blend out. You can, on edges where there's sharp edges and a lot of light would be hitting, you can be more extreme. You can apply more of this color, pick out all those little tiny edges, especially on his hat. There's a lot of little borders and molded edges, and you want to especially take your time to pick out all of those with this high sort of silver color so that you really get this nice shiny effect on all of the sort of molded raised details of his hat. So even though it would have been really nice if we'd been done with the white already, we weren't. There's still a lot of other white areas left to paint. The reason we didn't do them earlier was just because where they were on the figure, we needed to paint some other layers first. So we're going to be working on sort of all the piping and edging on this figure now, and also, of course, the drum, which has quite a lot of white on it. So what I've taken here is I'm going to do it a little bit faster, I should first say, than I did before. These are all very thin, sort of narrow areas, so I'm not so worried about the blending and getting so much subtle difference in color. So I'm going to start out by base coating all these areas with just pure foundry stone light, and I thinned it down a lot. It's very important that the paint flows really well here because there's so many fine edges and lines that you carefully have to do that it needs to go on very, very easily. So you can see here, I'm going to be going along now with that stone and just picking out all of the piping, which is going to be mostly on his sleeves. There's a little bit on a back pocket, but mostly it's that. So you're just going to, you know, this is just, you know, very carefully going in, picking out those piping areas. And I'm also going to be doing that on the drum as well. All the edges of the drum and all that straps, those straps, they're going to be white. So all of that needs to be base coated in this stone color, and you need to, of course, be careful there that you don't get all that white over onto that gold area that we just finished doing. And then I'm going to take some white paint, which I've thinned a lot so it flows really easily. That's very important. And I'm going to start applying that to all those piped areas, just going over that gray. It's thin, so it's going to be fairly transparent, so you're going to get a little contrast from that gray underneath. You may not want to put white. If there's any areas where the gray or the piping crosses deep wrinkles or folds, you may not want to put white down in there, but otherwise you're going to want to be putting it pretty much everywhere. It's not going to come out pure white to begin with anyway because it's so thin and you're putting it over this gray color. So, you know, I'm just going to be putting it sort of everywhere. If there's areas like that, you can see where there's different separate pieces of piping. You can leave the dark gray at the very edges so it looks like, you know, to sort of differentiate the specific pieces. And once the areas are dry, you can go back over them again, especially areas sort of in the very middle, to make it look lighter, and apply another layer to get it even brighter. And the drum is basically the same thing. You're going to be wanting to put just white over everything, but it's very important that you leave lines in between all the areas so that stone base color really shows, like in between the different like straps and bands. You need to make sure you leave some of that dark gray showing so that all the different parts will be clearly delineated. So this is a little bit more time consuming to make sure that this comes out looking right. And it's also, again, transparent, so you're not getting to get a pure white right off the bat. You're going to probably want to go back a couple of times and brighten up some areas, especially sort of the rim of the drum. You're going to want to get those larger areas brighter white, so you'll need to apply a couple coats. And don't worry too much. If you make a mess at this point, it's going to happen because there's so many little detail areas. It's fixable. Like, for example, on the drum, I went back in with just some stone light, and I, sort of cleaned up down in some of those creases where I'd gotten some white paint and sort of made them sharper and cleaner as necessary. And on the sleeves, I got stripes that were a little too wide, a little too rough, I took some Prussian blue and I sort of thinned those lines, kind of cleaned them up. And that's almost going to be inevitable when you're working on something with this much edging and detail. You're going to have to do some cleanup probably to just make sure that you get the sharpest, nicest lines that you possibly can. So don't feel too bad about that. It's almost unavoidable that's going to happen with something like this. Next, I'm going to paint the top and bottom of the drum, which is a little bit tricky now because, especially on the top, it's quite obscured. So I'm sorry if you can't see what I'm doing there all the time. I'm taking here a Foundry Boneyard medium, and I'm going to just kind of base coat both areas. And I'm applying it in sort of a splotchy, blotty fashion because, when you hit the drum, it's sort of a stretched animal skin. As you hit it, you're going to get sort of splotchy, blotty effect on it, also just from pounding on the drum over time. So you can feel free to apply all the paint to the drum in sort of a stipply fashion. That'll make it look more realistic. So I'm going to apply that medium shade, then I'm going to take Boneyard Light and basically go back over it. I'm going to start from the center of the drum always and work outward, so that's always darkest at the edges. So I'm going to stipple in the Boneyard Light then into the middle of the drum, building outwards basically. And then I'm finally going to finish off by taking just some pure white and just putting that kind of in the very center, but again, stippling it a little bit so that you get this kind of sort of pattern and look that the drum is being, has been pounded, basically. And the drum is still not done because these drums would have had sort of a border, a pattern around the rims. In this case, it was red, and they were sort of diagonal stripes. This is kind of a pain to paint because you have to be careful not to get it over those straps that are going around the drum body and also not onto the drum base. So this is probably a case, if you do this, you'll have to paint these in, then you may have to go back in and do some cleanup work where that red color got places that you didn't want it to be. So, sorry about that. Try to get the stripes as even as you can. I'm not always that good at that, but if you can, that's good. I'm taking Vallejo Black Red here, just like I used on the rest of the red areas, and I'm just sort of using that to rough out my stripes and sort of get the right positioning and get them kind of where I want them. And if I get them too wide or too narrow or the spacing is a little off, I can go back in with some white paint and kind of thin them down or kind of correct the spacing in that way. Once the red stripes are in the right position, the right width more or less, and I've kind of cleaned them up so that they don't run into other colors, I'm then going to quickly highlight them using the same reds I did before. So first I'm taking the Mephiston red and going over them. I'm kind of starting in the centers and working out so that you still get a little darker edge to them because I think that looks a little bit nicer. And of course you want to focus especially on the top rims of the drum because you're going to expect that to be lighter. Those rims and edges will get more paint. And then you can see I'm also going to be painting a little red stripe there on his drumstick holders. Just because in reality all the piping on these Prussian uniforms would have been white, but then with an even finer red stripe down the middle of it. If you can imagine painting that, I don't even want to think about it. That's horrifying, and it would be almost impossible to do at this scale and have it look good. So I've opted to just do all this uniform piping in white, not try to paint some red lines down the middle, because it would be so difficult to get it to look nice. So I'm just doing a little sort of wink to that, I guess, by putting that little red line on the drumstick holders, but that's as far as I'm going to go. And I'm going to be taking then finally the Evil Sunz Scarlet, as you can see, and adding one final extreme highlight to those drum stripes. I'm going to now quickly paint the drumsticks. I'm going to base coat them using Foundry Spear Shaft shade color, and then I'm just going to take sort of successively the Spear Shaft medium and go over that, and then the Spear Shaft light. And I'm just going to sort of make sure I leave the shade color sort of down at the bottom edge, and also make sure there's sort of a line in between the round end of the stick and sort of the rest of the stick, so you can sort of see a difference there. So I'm not going to highlight that very much. Now I just want to take care of a couple details. He's got kind of a tassel on top of his hat. This was different colors. This unit had a light blue one. So I'm base coating it with a 50-50 mix of the dark Prussian blue from Vallejo and the gray blue. And then I'm going to highlight that with some just pure gray blue, because it really was a light blue color. And, you know, if you want to even higher highlight in the top, you can add in a bit of white to that and just make sure that it stays dark down at the roots. But this is such a small area, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting a decent effect. I'm also going to take some Vallejo Air Steel. I'm going to thin it down a lot, and I'm going to apply it very lightly to his water bottle, because that was kind of a metal, a very dark metal. And so I'm just applying it to one edge and sort of feathering it away from that edge so it looks shiny on one side. And like the edges are really metallic, but there's still a lot of dark base color showing through. And here is our finished sort of AWI 7 Years War Hessian Grenadier drummer. I hope you found this useful to paint. I know drummers, musicians are a great deal more complicated than normal figures. As a matter of fact, usually difference in detail and complexity is pretty great between musicians and sort of the rest of the guys in the regiment. But most of that really comes from all the sort of extra piping that you have to worry about, and all this edging and stuff on their uniforms that everybody else didn't have. But otherwise, the uniform was pretty much, especially with these Hessians, as I said in the introduction, was basically sort of the same thing. Same colors applied in the same areas. So I think even if you're not going to be worrying about all that crazy piping and stuff, you know, you can still watch this tutorial and get a good idea about how you would go about painting your normal Hessian Grenadiers, or even just a normal Hessian soldier. They would just have a more simple tricorn hat that they would be wearing, so you wouldn't have to be worrying about all the extra metal and that red back and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things here that, you know, you can apply to a lot of different kinds of figures. And another thing that maybe is interesting, I wasn't like directly showing it, but all that piping and striping I did in the sleeves, if you're going to be doing an AWI Hessian, I mentioned earlier that their pants were often striped, so you might want to keep that in mind. You would be doing a very similar thing on the pants, basically, with those guys, except it'd be a red or blue color. You'd be painting sort of vertical stripes, so, you know, it doesn't hurt, you know, to practice your kind of line and stripe painting, because it's going to be, you know, that's going to be something you're going to be probably doing quite a bit of anyway with AWI soldiers. If you want them to be accurate, you're going to be making those striped pants, so, you know, get used to it, I guess. So once again, please like this video, share it with your friends, favorite it on Facebook, and, you know, leave me comments. I don't know if I'll be doing more user request videos for the moment. We'll see. I haven't decided. I actually have a couple ideas for next week for once, so that's good. And if you need to, you know, keep up with my channel, you can always also subscribe so that you get updates when I post new videos, and, you know, you'll know as soon as I put things out. Even though it's usually on Sunday afternoon my time, you know, it's still good if you want to really keep up with my exact release schedule. So I think that's everything, and I will see you next week.